All right, this is a short recording, covers the history of the Articles of Confederation, America's first mistake, not to be its last, of course, and the historical period around then. There's a note sheet that's included in the show notes if you'd like to follow along using that. It might make things easier. So, while all the state constitutions were being created, the Continental Congress continued to meet as a political body. The Continental Congress was the group that passed things like the Declaration of Independence. It was in charge of appointing George Washington as the commander in chief of the army, stuff like that. But despite being technically the only central government that the United States had, it was a loose confederation, and most significant power continued to be held by the individual states. By 1777, members of the Congress realized that they should have some clearly written rules for how they were organized. As a result, they drafted the Articles of Confederation. These were drafted and passed by Congress in November 1777. The first national constitution, quote unquote, for the United States wasn't particularly innovative and mostly put into written form how Congress had just de facto operated since 1775. Even though the articles were rather modest in their proposals, they wouldn't actually be ratified by all the states until after Yorktown in 1781. Even this was accomplished largely because just the danger of war required cooperation. So, the purpose of these initial Articles of Confederation is pretty clear if we take a look at it. Congress had control over such things like diplomacy, printing money, resolving controversies between different states, kind of if they agreed, and most importantly, coordinating the war effort. In other words, the purpose of the Articles of Confederation was to fight and win a war against Great Britain. All of its powers were geared for that purpose and that purpose only. The most important action of the Continental Congress was the creation and maintenance of the Continental Army. Even in this area, however, the central government's power was pretty limited. Congress could send out requests for different states to contribute resources and numbers of men for the army, but it couldn't force the states to obey. So if Virginia didn't want to send its men to defend New York, it did not have to. And that could potentially be a major problem, though, in spite of it all, it was never enough of a problem to stop them from winning. The organization of the Articles of Confederation left much to be desired, and itself demonstrates the primacy of state power. Each state had one vote. 9 out of the 13 states had to support a law for it to be enacted. So Rhode Island, tiny little Rhode Island, got just as much say as the most populous state, Virginia, and as much say as New York, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, all those places. Tiny Rhode Island counts just as much in the Articles of Confederation. Furthermore, any changes to the Articles required unanimous agreement. In a one state, one vote rule, state sovereignty was given the primary place even within what was supposed to be a national government. Furthermore, the entire national government consisted of a unicameral Congress. So that means one body. So today in our government, we have an executive branch, the president, we have a legislative branch, Congress, and we have a judicial branch, the Supreme Court. The Articles of Confederation only had the legislative branch, and that's also a major problem. The National Congress's limited power was especially clear when it came to money. Not surprisingly, given that the revolution's causes centered on opposition to taxes, the central government was given absolutely no power to raise its own revenues through taxation. All it was allowed to do was request that the states give it the money necessary to run the government and wage the war. As you can imagine, this left George Washington and the other military commanders from time to time sweating just a tad. By the end of the war, the central government had completely run out of money and was bankrupt. In fact, it was bankrupt, if we want to be technical, going back to 1780, before the Articles of Confederation were even ratified. As a result, the paper currency that the Articles of Confederation government were issuing was effectively worthless. One man who tried to do something about all this was Robert Morris. Robert Morris was Congress's superintendent of finance in 1781. He did a lot of things. This is just one of them. He tried to forge a solution to the dilemma that the states were facing. He wanted to expand existing government power and secured special privileges for what he thought would solve the problem: a united bank, a Bank of North America, which was an attempt to stabilize the value of the paper money issued by Congress. His actions went well beyond the limited powers granted to the national government under the Articles of Confederation. But still, by even just creating this bank, he successfully limited what was runaway inflation by resurrecting the financial stability of the national government. Now, his big goal here and his idea to try to solve this problem was consolidation of debt. All of the different colonies had taken on different debts during the war. The larger states and the states that saw the most fighting, you're going to think about places like Massachusetts, took on the most debt. And his plan was to consolidate all of the state debts together into one federal debt, and therefore tie the colonies together with a financial incentive. And of course, as the chief financial officer of the Congressional Congress, this would also make Robert Morris the most powerful man in the United States. When this didn't initially pass through the Continental Congress, Morris took a gamble, a dangerous gamble. Nearby, in Yorktown, were the disaffected troops of General George Washington, who were still kind of just milling about after the victory over Cornwallis. He encouraged their officers to seek a possible coup to try to overthrow the government. I mean, these men hadn't been paid in months, and Morris sent a delegation basically encouraging them to revolt unless the Continental Congress granted the government the right to raise taxes, which he could then use to pay for the Bank of North America. The plan didn't go as expected. When George Washington got wind of the idea, he was horrified and quashed the entire thing. A national bank for the United States is going to continue to be an issue well past the election of 1800. Another major issue facing the early Continental Congress was westward expansion, land issues. You'll recall early on that when, the different kings and queens of England issued those colonial charters way back in the 17th and even 16th centuries, we had no idea the size of the United States of America or of North America, South America, Central America, any of it. So some states like Virginia just had charters that specified a northern boundary and a southern boundary, but no western boundary. So technically, Virginia went all the way to California in many cases, or perhaps the Mississippi. So, what are we going to do with all of this new territory? Because don't forget, under the Treaty of Paris that ends the Revolutionary War, the United States is granted large swaths of land west of the Appalachian Mountains. So, between 1784 and 1787, the Continental Congress actually successfully drafts and passes a series of pieces of legislation to deal with this issue. Thomas Jefferson, writing in 1784, created a bill that would have encouraged states to create territories west of the Appalachian Mountains and encourage settlers to move west. George Washington actually opposed this idea because he thought, quite rightly, that it would lead to unnecessary clashes with Indian nations who were already well established beyond the mountains. Before this bill could pass, the Continental Congress passed the Land Ordinance of 1785, which dealt with the territories that today make up the states of Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, and Wisconsin. The land would be divided up into townships of 36 acres, and after being surveyed, would be sold to settlers. Indian lands would be purchased and would not be forcibly taken. That's a rule that's going to be applied basically when we feel like it, unfortunately. The final land bill was called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. It built itself upon the previous ordinance, but added two principal and really key components. Number one, new territories would not be treated as subordinate colonies. New territories would be eligible for statehood and could petition for such after a period of time. And also crucially, slavery would be banned north of the Ohio River. Essentially, once we get past the Revolution, slavery becomes the principal issue that's going to dictate just about everything from now through the Civil War. And early on, as you can see, it crops up. Now, in addition to all of this, there were major economic problems in the early United States. 7 years of war had left the colonies bankrupt. Britain refused to trade with the United States, cutting off not only a vital trade route back to England itself, but to all the British colonial possessions in the Caribbean. Different states would reduce their import duties tariffs to attract business. So, for example, Rhode Island might say, "Here, bring your ships here to Providence. We'll drop our trade duties for you. Don't go to New York." But then in exchange, New York might say, "Okay, well, we're going to drop our trade duties even lower." All this did was lose more and more money for the colonies, money that they couldn't afford to lose. And currency, by the way, hard coin, was pretty hard to come by, as technically in 1785, the United States had three, yes, three total banks. I drove past seven, I counted, on my way into school today. They had three total banks, one in New York, one in Philadelphia, and one in Boston. Moreover, with more men, poorer men, able to vote, no sooner had the revolution come to a close, the revolution about no taxation without representation, that the Americans started to complain about taxes, albeit this time, American taxes. Worry that this would all lead to a major revolution came to pass in the winter of 1787, when disaffected farmers in western Massachusetts rose in rebellion in what is called Shays' Rebellion. They demanded that Massachusetts issue paper currency and give them more time to repay their debts. Basically, the idea is what they wanted was this. Let's say that you owed someone $100, and that was $100 in gold coins. Those were tough to come by. But if you could convince Massachusetts to just issue dollars, then all of a sudden you could get your hands on $100 that aren't worth anything very quickly. But the contract just says $100, so here's your 100 monopoly dollars and goodbye. That's what they wanted. Massachusetts wasn't biting, and unfortunately had to dispatch 4,000 militiamen to end the revolt, and resulted in 4 deaths. George Washington and many others were appalled by this and realized that if the United States was to survive, it would need a stronger and more centralized government. And that, ladies and gentlemen, sets the stage for the Constitutional Convention.